All right, so why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself, and maybe provide a little bit of background on why I considered you a good source for this project.
Okay. I'll try to start at the beginning. My undergraduate degree was in communication systems management, which is kind of like an MIS degree. And I worked for 3 years as an engineer for MCI. First it was WorldCom, then it was MCI WorldCom. Now it's Verizon, right?
Okay.
While I was working for MCI, it was when all the stuff hit the fan with sort of Bernie Ebbers and so while I was working there, I also started to realize that wasn't really the life I wanted to lead. I started applying to graduate schools. I applied to English programs. I didn't know that there was a way to do something like what I was already doing that had anything to do with English. I thought I was leaving that life behind me.
Okay.
I ended up at Carnegie Mellon getting an MA in English. It's actually an MA in Literature and Cultural Studies. Had no idea what rhetoric was at that time. Started to realize toward the end of that program that I could start to talk about issues that were interesting to people in English departments that also were sort of drawing on some of my previous experience as a sort of tech person. Ended up at the University of Texas in a program that used to be called Computers in English. Now it's called Digital Literacies and Literatures. So my PhD was in English with a specialization in digital literacies and literatures and rhetoric. So now what I work on is, and my dissertation was on Wikipedia, so now what I work on is sort of new media environments, what that means for writing, what that means for rhetoric. My most recent interests are in software and how software shapes our online sort of experiences, how software changes the ways we interact with one another, how software itself is an authored artifact, so is the result of writing. So I have these two parallel, I guess, sets of interest, right? I have sort of English studies, rhetoric and composition, and then technology sort of broadly defined. I'm now sort of getting interested in games and all kinds of other stuff.
All right. Thanks, James.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Brown.
Jim is fine.
Jim. All right. So I have my own definition of the cloud, and I want to hear yours.
Okay. Oh, man. Okay, so the way I understand the cloud, my first interaction with the term, or with the concept of cloud computing, was either a commercial, but more likely Nick Carr's book. Do you know this book, The Big Switch?
Mm-hmm.
So I read The Big Switch and started to realize that this was a kind of general shift that was happening. While I don't really usually agree with anything that Nicholas Carr says, that book really did kind of open my eyes to where we're headed, right? That we're sort of creating an infrastructure much like the power grid that people will be able to sort of plug into and use rather than investing in sort of farms and farms of servers, and et cetera. That's the first time I heard the term. Now I guess it just keeps getting more and more slippery with how this term is used. So, for instance, I teach students how to use the YouTube online video editor. That YouTube has their own within the browser editor. Now I hear people talking about that as like a cloud-based editor. So I guess for people who are using it that way, the cloud really just means sort of anything, any sort of networked resource. And I guess that's kind of the way people are using it now, is like being able to access stuff from anywhere, things like Dropbox or, but my understanding of sort of cloud-based computing initially was this sort of notion that computing would be, again, something we plug into, like we plug our computers into power outlets. And I guess that does sort of work in the examples that I've given. But my interest in it is then how, for someone who teaches writing and new media classes, it's actually really a useful model, because I don't have to make as many assumptions about what students have access to. So maybe I'm now moving into another question, but I'll stop there. That's my sort of loose definition of things.
Okay, and then just to give you where I'm standing on it, I'm pretty much there. I consider it to be Google, or Gmail, Google Docs, Facebook, Twitter, Blackboard, YouTube, anything that anybody can essentially put part of themselves digitally elsewhere that they don't have to have on their home computer, that they can access from literally any access point that they have in their hand.
Yeah.
So we're talking the same thing. So, so McLuhan, this quote from him that I kind of dug up, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, or at least his idea of it. I'm going to read it first here. It's today's child is bewildered when he enters the 19th century environment that still characterizes the educational establishment, where information is scarce, but ordered and structured by fragmented, classified patterns, subjects, and schedules. So he kind of had that idea of, it's 19, and this was in 67 when he says this. So he says, okay, it's 1967, yet you're still delivering this stuff to these people the same way it was delivered in the 19th century, and the same way it was probably delivered in the 18th century. Now we're in 2011. Do you think that 19th century based environment still exists?
Yeah, I mean, I still work in an English department, and there's people that work in this department with me that are totally baffled by what I'm interested in, what I'm doing research on, because it doesn't really necessarily easily fit under the rubric of English or under the rubric of rhetoric and composition even. And so what McLuhan is talking about there is how sort of disciplines carve up knowledge into neat little categories, and that doesn't actually work that way. That we are able to sort of think across these boundaries if we're given the opportunity to do so. I think what McLuhan's suggesting is, and it's not really that far off, right? Today, excuse me, what our system of education is not designed to allow people to think across those boundaries. So, for instance, my interest in software, I'm not an expert programmer. I like to tinker and sort of fiddle with things and see what I can figure out. How can I take that interest and bring it to bear on English studies, or vice versa? How can I take my interest in rhetoric and composition and bring it to bear on people, in conversations with people who, say, design software? Those are things that, I mean, one could argue that those things are becoming easier to do now. And you could argue that sort of technology is part of that becoming easier. I mean, it's not a determinative thing. It's not that technology has created this situation in which we can do this. And some people accuse McLuhan of being a technological determinist, that these changes are being brought about because of technology. If you read a little deeper into McLuhan, you find it's not quite so simple.
Right.
But I do agree that the sort of system of education, which is just a slow-moving beast, is certainly built for that model. And what's interesting, there are some changes that you can start to see the sort of kernels of changes. So, for instance, a number of universities are doing what they're calling cluster hires. These cluster hires are an attempt to get people from various disciplines who are addressing a similar question to talk to each other. So a university doesn't say, we need to hire 2 more English professors. Instead, they might say, we need to have a new media initiative across the university. We're going to hire someone in art, we're going to hire someone in English, we're going to hire someone in architecture, and someone in computer science. They're all going to be hired under this same sort of pool of money, and we're going to get these people in the same room or in some way get them interacting to address a similar set of questions, right? What that does is gets people thinking across these disciplinary boundaries without trying to sort of destroy the structure of a university that is sort of so reliant on disciplines, right? We're not going to just say tomorrow, okay, no more English departments. That's not going to happen. What you can do is build stuff on top of the existing infrastructure, like these sort of cluster hires, to get people thinking outside of those boxes.
So would you consider yourself someone who's definitely pushing in that direction to get those things to happen? Or do you kind of find yourself looking for others to make the push, and once the push is made, you'll help fill that void that's been created?
It's tricky because, I mean, I do think I'm a person who's looking to sort of make those things happen. Being an untenured academic means that in some way you have to sort of play the game that's the traditional game alongside this attempt to kind of push the boundaries. I mean, my sort of gut reaction would be that it's the role. I mean, the role of people who have tenure and who are more secure in their employment to do that kind of work. And I think that's, in a lot of places, that is where this kind of stuff is happening. That people who are established in their various fields but are interested in pushing boundaries are doing that. But really, these things are only going to continue to happen as people think more and more about how to kind of not necessarily even change their disciplines, but just sort of think more creatively about points of overlap between something like rhetoric and something like, say, design.